Okay, so this screencast is on Jackie's debut, a unique day. Hopefully, you've already been viewing your slideshow on the narrative essay. Jackie's debut, a unique day, is obviously is about the arrival of Jackie Robinson into professional baseball. So we're just going to break it down using our so what and the seven common moves. Hopefully, you are reading these simple essays that I'm providing for you, and you are taking note of the things that successful writers do based on the seven common moves. So the purpose of this essay is not expressed in a thesis statement in the first paragraph. Instead, it's kind of a question that's kind of between the lines. Don't you think that this shows that the wise men in the tavern thought integration would ruin baseball? Don't you think that was foolish? The runner who tried to spite Robinson at first base, don't you think that was mean spirited or racial prejudice? Or what about the man that would give a day's wages for a baseball? Don't you think this tells you how much Robinson meant to the African American community? Perhaps the big question with this story is, don't you think that a world without racial prejudice is a lot nicer than one with it? But to say that would be something called moralizing. And that's a move that always runs the risk of off putting some of your audience. So that's why Royko never says it out loud. He makes us feel it instead, and we're allowed to make our own judgments and our own assumptions. Jackie's story, or Jackie's debut, is a story about good and evil. It's a boy's story, but it deals with issues that transcend age and gender and personal memories. It's a story about prejudice. A story about prejudice of one kind is a story of prejudice about all kinds. He doesn't oversimplify. We are allowed to see the evil in the hearts of the people who, in many circumstances, we would consider quite good. He did. Even heroic, famous athletes, family men enjoying one another's company on a day off. It's not just good guys against bad guys. It's ugly attitudes and behaviors in people who are otherwise not so bad. This is part of the surprise element in the so what factor, part of the spin that would not have been obvious to everyone who witnessed the same events. The beginning, he creates interest at the outset by setting out the mystery and the conflict. In the first paragraph, the wise men are worried about what it would do to baseball. And the second paragraph tells us that baseball seemed about to be ruined. Just from that, even people who don't really follow the sport are a little intrigued to read a bit further in order to figure it out. The use of the pronoun it is a gimmick. It's one of those beginning moves in an introduction for good beginnings. Use of the pronoun it without an antecedent is called a blind beginning. It's designed to create a mystery. We don't know what it is, so we have to keep reading to figure it out. Next, he announced the conflict. Something is about to ruin baseball. And Royko is hoping that we'll read on to find out what it is and how it could possibly ruin baseball. The ending has a coda, which is Italian for a tail. It's something that's added at the end of a composition to bring it to a close. It's a musical term. His coda consists of a few lines of reflection many years after the game has ended. He talks about after Jackie's death, the sense of respect that he had for the subject, and in a time when the U.S. was torn by deep racial hostility. He seems to suggest in a very gentle way that the conflict between meanness and generosity of spirit had not changed much since Robinson's first game. For his details, there's a good balance between showing and telling. Telling is summarizing, giving a reaction to things. He says, I've forgotten most of the details of the game other than that the Dodgers won and Robinson didn't get a hit or do anything special, although he was cheered on every swing and every routine play. That's telling. It's summarizing the events of the game. But showing us, he lets the readers witness the scene or what's happening in the words for themselves. When Robinson stepped into the batter's box, it was as if someone had flicked a switch. The place went silent. He swung at the first pitch, and they erupted as if he had knocked it over the wall. but it was only a high foul that dropped into the box seats. Showing us is dramatizing what you're talking about. You want to balance telling and showing. Telling, again, if you remember from your descriptive essay, just telling us, it runs the risk of being summary or just a list. So you want to show us so that we can visualize it in full detail. Showing is always livelier than telling, and yet telling has its purposes. Writers can't show us everything and quote every word that's spoken. They would never finish a story if they did. So usually the advice is show and don't tell. But the more precise advice would be to shout the rule and whisper the exception. Show us and tell. A good rule for deciding when to quote and when to paraphrase is this. Quote whenever the words are interesting in themselves or when they reveal something about the character who speaks them. Otherwise, paraphrase. Using your quotes in your personal narrative that you're going to be writing, you don't want to say, oh, hey, mom, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? Those are not important quotes that add interest or they reveal anything about the character who speaks them. So use them wisely. For the most part, Royko follows ordinary chronological order. He tells us what happens before the game, during the game, after the game, and even further after the game into the future. But it's not just organized by chronological time, it's plotted. It's a series of mysteries and partial acts and unresolved conflicts from the beginning to the end. The mystery of the it that's going to ruin baseball is solved in paragraph 5 when we discover that the men in the tavern were talking about Jackie Robinson playing at Wrigley Field. But as soon as he solves this mystery, he makes us curious again by describing a partial act. So the next day, another kid and I started walking to the ballpark early. A journey has begun, and we feel inclined to stay with it until we arrive at the destination, Wrigley Field, where, of course, we are instantly made curious about the game himself. What's going to be so big about him being at Wrigley Field? In short, the story is told that every time our curiosity is satisfied, it's aroused again by another conflict or a partial act. This is what makes the difference between organization and plot, that continual sense of unfinished business. For style, he makes several allusions. He references Wheaties, that breakfast is still advertised as the breakfast of champions. He uses irony. I felt about baseball the way that Abe Lincoln felt about education, suggesting that his devotion to baseball may have been just a little bit excessive because we all know how Abe Lincoln felt about education. He uses similes. When Robinson stepped into the batter's box, it was as if someone had flicked a switch. Like or as comparison as a simile. He uses thick description that had church clothes and funeral clothes, suits, white shirts, ties, gleaming shoes, and straw hats. His verbs are almost always action verbs. Hung, sounded, watched, spilled, jostled, flicked, swung, erupted, coroned. That's when you hit a ball and it kind of wings off of one and ricochets off to another one. Applauded, mumbled, regretted. They're action verbs. Those are those vivid action verbs that you want to try to use in your writing. Careful writers don't hesitate to use the verb to be when they need it, but they avoid it whenever they can to use an action verb instead. So the voice, even though this essay appeared in a newspaper column, it was an editorial column where personal voice and attitude are appropriate. I, using a personal attitude or judgment, that attitude is appropriate to the purpose of the essay. For all its simplicity, his voice is actually quite complex. The writer seems to be two persons at once, that naive adolescent who thinks baseball is the most important thing in the world, and at the same time, a mature columnist who understands that Robinson's participation in the major leagues had an importance far greater than the sport itself. Every detail in a well-written essay has its purpose. Remember, it fits together like a puzzle piece. It doesn't just happen. There are lots of other things that he could have described, but he didn't describe those things because it didn't contribute to what he wanted to convey to his readers. Hopefully, you understand this essay a little bit better, and you can use it as a sample essay to help you writing your own personal narrative.